do have skills that make me a nightmare for people like you.
Mr. Mount, good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Chair. Good morning, Commissioners. Kia ora tātou. Day 9 of this hearing, and we have 3 witnesses scheduled. The first will be Mr. Mike Leddingham, and after Mr. Leddingham we have Professor Des Cahill and Dr. Peter Wilkinson. They will all be led by Hannah James, who joins me from the Council Assisting team. I'll say a couple of words, if I may, about the evidence today. The focus today is obviously on faith-based institutions and abuse in that context. But it would be wrong to think of abuse in the care of the state and abuse in the care of faith-based institutions as 2 completely separate categories. What we know is that, in fact, many people experienced both forms of abuse, and many people transitioned through both state care and the care of faith-based institutions through the course of their lives. It's also not the case that this final day of the hearings is the only day in which we are addressing abuse in the care of faith-based institutions. By my count, at least 8 witnesses have already discussed abuse in the care of faith-based institutions. As we have explained previously, the way we are approaching this inquiry is to divide the very broad terms of reference into a series of investigations. We will very soon be commencing the process of investigations into faith-based institutions, and that process will be a searching and exacting process which will take some time, but it will reflect the seriousness with which this inquiry views abuse in the care of the churches and other such institutions. I also want to emphasise that the survivors of abuse in the care of the churches and faith-based institutions are very welcome at the inquiry's private sessions, and large numbers of such stories have already been heard by the commissioners. So there is no prioritising or ranking of experiences of abuse. And Mr. Chair, we all recall the very clear message you gave to the government as part of the consultation process, where you reflected the message from those you spoke to that abuse is abuse, and we do not differentiate between different forms of abuse in this inquiry. We will hear today about overseas inquiries and what they have learned about abuse in the care of faith-based institutions, particularly in Australia. So that's all I wanted to say by way of introduction, but as I say, Ms. James will deal with the witnesses today.
Thank you, Mr. Mount, for explaining the landscape of the Royal Commission, particularly insofar as those people who are of a faith-based background. Ms. James, good morning. Please proceed.
May it please the Commissioners, we have our first witness, Mr. Mike Leddingham, and I will let the Chair administer.
Mr. Leddingham, good morning.
Morning.
In terms of the Inquiries Act 2013, under which the Royal Commission is operating, I'm required to seek your answer to an initial question, which is, do you solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence you will give before this Commission will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do, as I remember it.
Thank you. Ms. James.
Thank you. Mr. Leddingham, is your full name Michael Joseph Leddingham?
Yes.
And you've prepared a statement for the Commissioner which you have signed and dated?
Yes.
And I understand that as we go through the evidence, there will be some changes because of subsequent events after you completed this.
Yeah, when we get to that stage, I will make a note to...
Perfect. And just before we start on your evidence, I understand that you have been notified that our chair is a Catholic, and as a courtesy, because you have experience of abuse in the Catholic Church, there has been a discussion about your comfort.
Yes. Not only am I representing myself here today, I'm representing my two younger brothers who were also abused. And we were speaking to them last night, and they found it odd that a member of the faith, the perpetrating faith, is in charge of this commission. But I have been assured that you are an honourable man, and when you'll deal with everything impartially and will advocate impartially, and on that advice, I'm happy with that. And I pass that on to my two brothers.
Thank you, Mr. Leddingham. I acknowledge and respect and understand what you have said. Myself and my 4 colleagues are New Zealanders of varied backgrounds: Samoan, Maori, European, and we come from a number of faiths, Presbyterian, Catholic, and I am Catholic, and that is widely known, and that has been made clear. But we have, assiduously as we can, endeavoured to make our footprint asserting our independence and our willingness to listen to everyone who comes before us, particularly those who have been survivors. So I acknowledge what you've said and can understand what you've said, and I'll now invite you to provide the material that you wish to bring to our attention. Thank you.
Thank you.
And just before we get into the evidence, can you confirm that where you speak about your brothers and a particular third party who is a friend of yours, that you have their consent?
Yes, I have their full consent to use their case as part of my submission.
Mr. Leddingham, can I ask you to start reading then from paragraph 2 of your statement?
All right, I've found it extremely difficult to formulate this address. It is hard to remain detached when you have experienced what we did. But for all the victims' sakes, here I am today, hopefully speaking for a vast silent majority also. I have written a book about our experience called The Catholic Boys. It was published in June this year, after taking me more than 20 years to write. I've had 3 other books published over the past 5 years after finding out later in life I did have a talent for writing, but Otho have learned this at a much younger age. My publisher, Mike Smith of BMS Books, Aotearoa, a Catholic himself, always knew I had this draft copy of The Catholic Boys squirreled away and kept encouraging me to finish. I'd put it aside many times before, not only because I kept becoming disgusted with recalling what had happened, but also our experience of the arrogant and seemingly non-caring attitude of the Catholic Church.
Mr. Leddingham, I intervene only to ask you to keep your eye on the stenotyper and the people who are translating into sign language what you're saying. And it's an obvious thing that, having said that, I'm asking you to please moderate the pace of what you're saying.
Moderate.
Can you speak a little
Go more slowly.
Okay, yep. All right, so I dithered around with it for 20 years, but this changed suddenly late last year when the Bishop of Adelaide proclaimed words to this effect: "I would never report a priest who confessed to sexual abuse. To me, for the victim, this is like having contact with God through the priest." I was outraged at this, and I thought, how sick is that? I was appalled like the people like that Bishop of Adelaide were in charge of the church. So it was exactly the motivation I needed, and I finished the book, ably supported by my sister Mary as the narrator, because I was too close to the story to do it, and my two younger brothers, who have each told the side of the sordid childhood.
And Mike, you say in your next paragraph that it took you some 40 years to fully disclose, and later in your brief you talk about why you didn't report. So can we then move on to paragraph 11?
I make no apology for my language when describing what happened. It may offend some of you, especially religious people, but then nobody really apologised to us when we disclosed that Catholic clergy performed deviant practices on us bewildered, frightened children.
Yep. Carry on.
The horrific abuse that happened can't be told and understood using polite words or watered-down rhetoric. I make the point also that I have not always been a good person. I was screwed up mentally for quite a few years and didn't always do the right things. But by the same token, I don't preach or tell people to follow me like churches do. I'm more like, don't follow me, I'm lost. We, my brothers and I, make up the numbers of countless other victims of abuse in the Catholic Church who are out there, and I somewhat feel we also have a duty to those silent, suffering people to try and bring a sick and self-centred institution out of the dark ages to face the realisation of what they have done. Sexually abusing anyone is a crime. Sexually abusing children is abominable. If any one of us did it, we would face years in jail. So how can they be allowed to get away with it?
And Mike, thank you for having the courage to come forward and tell your story. Can you now describe what happened to you, starting at paragraph 27?
Okay, what happened? On the face of it, we grew up in a great example of a Catholic family with strong Irish roots. My family was typical of many of those who lived in the area. My father worked, my mother stayed at home, and us 8 kids were raised to respect adults and those in authority, especially priests of the Catholic Church. We were regarded as what was then called a good Catholic family, and it was always impressed on us from an early age that we were privileged to be members of the one true church and had standards to uphold. My brothers and I served as altar boys at the local Catholic church. We attended the local parish convent school, St. Joseph's, Onehunga. There were many religious visitors to our house. We became accustomed to seeing them, liked most of them, and unfortunately, as it turned out, trusted them implicitly. In our small wee eyes, the Catholic Church was all-powerful, always correct, and in fact infallible.
And then, when did the abuse begin for you? And you have that at paragraph 34.
For me, my memory, the actual abuse proper began in 1958 at Father Frank Breen's auntie's house in Mount Roskill. Previously, when doing gymnastics, or especially when riding in the front seat of his car, he would rub up and down your legs and body quite inappropriately, but we didn't understand that at the time. We'd gone up to his auntie's place, ostensibly, as I remember, to redecorate the place while she was away. We worked for a while, then stopped for a break. He asked me how my training for the silver badge in gymnastics was going. I said, okay, except for the splits exercise, which I found really hard. Green said he could help me and got me to do the splits. Well, he got down behind me and began rubbing the area of my crack in my balls, which surprised and unsettled me. After a while, he said it would be a lot easier if I took my strides off. I was unsure and unwilling to do this, but he ordered me to do it. He then started stroking and massaging my whole genital area. Well, he went quiet and strange breathing heavily, with some sort of movement of his body going on. I understand now that he was masturbating himself, although again, as an 8-year-old child with no ideas about sexual matters, I certainly didn't understand this at the time.
And you have described the effect that this abuse had on you.
Well, yeah, you need to understand that I was only an 8-year-old. We'd had no sexual, we knew nothing about sex. In fact, it was a taboo subject. I was totally uncomprehending, shocked, frightened and sickened. I felt very dirty. When he was finished, I went straight to the toilet and locked myself in and just sat there in abject misery till he ordered me out, dropped me home and left with not even a word spoken. My life had suddenly turned into a total nightmare. More especially after all the teaching about love of God, piety, purity, burning in hellfire forever if you sin, being hammered into you from an early age. I understand now that for an 8-year-old child, me, this was quite a catastrophic event in my life. I was so traumatised by the event, I never once managed to tell a soul what had happened till years later.
And you've also described the effects it had on your health and your education.
I developed asthma around that time. My attention at school was sadly lacking, and the nuns were pretty quick to dish out the strap or other punishments for this. Green very quickly followed up the abuse with orders to the nuns for me to report to him at the presbytery after school for unspecified reasons. After just about sweating blood all day over this, sick and frightened about what might occur, I knew I could not ignore this instruction. Once there, he would always accuse you of some sort of misdemeanour. All bullshit, of course. Theft, damage to the school or church or graveyard. But his favourite subject was talking about masturbating. He seemed to have a fixation on this heinous sin that I didn't even know what he was talking about and became even more confused. I can still remember him asking me what colour the fluid was that came out of my penis when I played with myself. For me, an 8-year-old boy, this was totally non-comprehensible. I couldn't. You begin to doubt yourself, your mind. This type of interrogation happened on at least 4 to 6 occasions that I recall, so you can imagine my attention at school had been well and truly diverted. I spent my time with my head over my shoulders, worrying, and after school could not get the hell out of that place quick enough. My asthma continued to plague me, meaning days at home in comparative safety, and I can remember the doctor telling Mum that there didn't seem to be a clinical reason for the asthma, so it must be a nervous thing. I think he was spot on. Funnily enough, as soon as I left secondary school and went working on a farm, the asthma disappeared and I've never had it since. I gave up church at that time too.
And Mike, you also talked about the abuse at the convent school, but did Father Green also insert himself into your home life?
He did.
It's paragraph 54.
54. wasn't really safe at home because Green turned up often because our mum did typing for the church. And remember, this priest was God on earth to an Irish Catholic family at that time. The intimidation continued on a regular basis. I remember once when my brother Jerry had a schoolmate come over for the weekend. Green heard about this. We found out years later that Green had also abused this boy. He called us both up to the presbytery after school, split us up into separate rooms, and told us that the other boy had told him we had all masturbated ourselves around the back of our house. We denied this, but he kept us there until we finally admitted it. And then he warned us that he would tell the nuns and our parents if we ever got together with that boy again. On the way home, Jerry said he hadn't done it, and I said I hadn't either, but neither of us actually told the other of the abuse that occurred to us at that time, because it was a dirty, terrible, dark secret. I think Green was scared we would compare notes with that other boy too, but I can tell you this, it was far from our minds. We were too scared to tell anyone about the nightmare we were now living.
And at paragraph 59, you list a lot of the profound effects that it had on you. Like
many other victim survivors, we lived in confusion and silence. I achieved no qualifications. I mistrusted authority. I developed a blind hatred of intimidation, which was to cost me a fair few good jobs. I did not feel safe letting people get close to me. I developed a drinking problem that I think I still have. I committed a few crimes in the latter 60s which could have had me in jail or Borstal if I'd been caught. But I always knew when to cut and run. After I joined the army, I did spend time in the military prison.
And up until that time, you had believed you were the only one experiencing abuse. What happened then, and how did you find out about your brothers?
I didn't know, but obviously he tried me, and because of the asthma and he wasn't getting a chance, he must have moved on to my younger brother Jerry. He's 11 months younger than me, so he could have only been 7 when this happened. We are very similar in thinking, but we have a few differing personality traits. He's a very private man, and I don't think he has told me the full extent of the abuse that occurred to him, but I could be wrong about this. What I do know is that, like a lot of the victims, he loathes the Catholic Church and distrusts them completely, which you can't blame him for given what happened and then the shameful way we were treated when we tried to get redress. I asked him if he would like to say something to you today, and he had this to say, I quote, "Nothing much has changed. They, the church, go on about how sorry they are and how they now look after the victims. But you know, not once in the 17 years since we were forced to go public has anyone even rung to see how we were travelling or if we needed anything. They are full of shit, and as far as I'm concerned, they can shove their sick religion right up their jacksie." Thanks for that, Jerry. That gets your point across pretty succinctly, I feel. My brother Chris was always a quieter, far more gentle and more studious type than me and Jerry. He wouldn't hurt a fly. And Jerry and I used to have to fight his battles for him at school. Mum always used to say, "Look after your little brother," and so we did. This part I find hard. Finding out in 2002, Green had got to him badly, upset me greatly. I felt I'd let him down and I cried. My sister Mary pointed out, given the powerlessness of the situation we were in, I wouldn't have been able to do anything about it anyway. But if I had known earlier, well, Green was still alive, I'd have nailed the bastard for sure. Chris used the money he got from the church to go to uni in Aussie. He achieved 2 degrees and had the education he was supposed to be that he would have got in his 20s had things been normal, with the chance of earning good money for far more years before retirement. Like the rest of us who were abused, he hasn't got much to retire with. In fact, with the interference abuse caused to our early education and the subsequent loss of further education, qualifications and employment, we are a typical example of many bright, intelligent children with potential to achieve and be financially independent who are now facing a meagre retirement. I asked Chris for you today, and this is what he said. Having read this book, Walking Towards Thunder, by Peter Fox, an ex-Aussie policeman who was trying to inquire into sexual abuse within the Catholic Church, he now knows the Catholic Church did conspire to cover up sexual abuse crimes. His quote stems from the Church's handling of the paedophile priest Dennis McAlinden, whom they knew had been abusing young girls for years. They claimed, beyond transferring him, what else could they do? My answer to that would be hand him over to the police. But the Church's canon law acknowledged the inherent sinfulness of clergy abusing children, but only required McAlinden to be rebuked and given warnings. They tried moving him, but that had failed. Canon law also dictated that a priest's good name be protected and secrecy demanded by Crimen Solitationis, a 1962 Holy Office instruction which American priest and academic Thomas Doyle would later describe as an explicit policy to cover up cases of abuse by clergy. So McAlinden's crimes were concealed, a pontifical secret. So that gives the lie to the fact that they weren't conspiring to cover up sexual abuse. Thanks, Chris. Chris, that tells the story and gives the lie to denials of organised cover-ups. Can I just explain Walking Towards Thunder? It's an Irish saying. It means in your life there'll be trouble and storms. And what you do is you walk towards the thunder and eventually you'll get through it and come out into the sunshine. And I think you should all read this book. It's a compelling read and it's a sad read. And I couldn't put it down.
Thank you, Mike. And then you talk about the effect on not only your life, but your brother's life and the family's life at paragraph 76.
76. The life after the abuse. My sister summed it up with her statement. Excuse me. With the abuse came our journey from a happy family with the usual happy, feisty kids to one of 3 troubled teenagers who became angry, abusing and self-abusing men with consequences for themselves and traumatic results for our family. Even today, there are still things in our family that have never been sorted because of religion. This sort of thing can split families. As I've said, after the abuse by Green, my attention waned at school and I stopped achieving. My health was affected. I'm not a professional man, nor am I well educated. In fact, you could well say I was brought up in the school of hard knocks and arse covering, literally. It is hard enough as a young child to recognise that the better your education, the better your employment would be without having someone having designs on your arse. I left school after the 5th form after failing school cert. From memory, I had asthma around the time of the exams, which didn't help, but I feel I never really regained the ground that those last miserable years of that convent cost me. I was certainly very mixed up and confused. When you've been brainwashed by religion and sexually abused by a priest at a young age, it's not a good recipe for logical thinking. Basically, I ran wild for 4 to 5 years, had jobs on farms, had altercations with bosses, had jobs at the freezing works, had altercations with fellow workers. Couldn't hold down a job very long. I had an almost pathological hatred of intimidation and wasn't a successful drinker. I got involved in brawls and vandalism, caught a few good hidings and left town a couple of towns one step ahead of the police, but I always seemed to know when to cut and run. Many of my friends in those days were Māori, and this remains so today. They thought I was a mad bastard. Up north they called me Crazy Horse. And I loved their humour, willingness to stand their ground and fight, and also their stoicism when suffering from racism, which there was a lot of back then. Doing national service in 1971, this is what I struck. The guys I was doing national service with, a lot of Māori boys, camaraderie, humour. So we decided to join the regular force, a lot of us, which was a good thing for me discipline-wise. It probably kept me out of jail. Although, as mentioned, I did do time in the military prison. I still hated intimidation, and over the years had several fights with more senior people. I did 2 tours up to Southeast Asia with the infantry battalion stationed there. Missed Vietnam, which we were brushed off about, but as we got older we realised we were lucky. And then in 1978 was talked into having a go at the SAS selection course. Surprising myself, I was one of 9 candidates from about 56 who passed, and I spent the next 7 years there. I can tell you this, nothing the SAS threw at me, physically or mentally, fazed me as much as the sexual and mental abuse I suffered as a child at that convent. Sadly, after 7 years with the SAS, the old intimidation thing rose again when, as a corporal, I attacked a warrant officer after an argument. The boys broke it up when it became obvious I was going to mangle them. That effectively was the end of my service after 15 years. In another 5 years I would have got a full military pension. I married a Māori girl I met in the army in my 30s, although I still had closeness and trust issues. We had 5 children rapidly. Sadly, one died just before she turned 3. My wife suffered from depression after this, and with my own problems, as well as grief, I wasn't too much good to her. And in the end, we split after 25 years. I brought my children up as heathens with a great contempt for any religion, but they also knew if they struck any problems, especially people problems, Dad would be there for them. You don't need a Bible in your hands to be a good person. I'm lucky. My children all have a good work ethic, are good people with many friends, from all cultures and walks of life. And I now live next door to one. Daughter has 2 boys, and 5 minutes away for another one, a girl, my muckles. I often look at the 8-year-old boy sometimes and wonder, he's about the age I was when I got abused. And although they're a lot more sophisticated now, he's not as streetwise as we were back then. But I'll say this, if anyone ever touched him, I'd cut their throat and happily go to jail for the rest of my life. Life is good, you might say, but I can't help feeling it should have been better for all of the victims. We all had something snatched away from us at a very young age that you can never get back. Trust and innocence. The Bishop of Auckland claimed that nobody knew anything about Green's offending in the 12 years it only hung a parish. But I find that extremely hard to believe. I was a single soldier for 11 years before I got married, lived in the barrack for 7 to 8 of those years. When you live close with others like that, you get to know what they like and if they have any particular bad habits, like being bent. Fortunately, we only found a couple like that in my time in the service. With what we now understand to be Green's history of offending, the argument that nobody knew doesn't wash with me, Mr. Bishop of Auckland. I firmly believe what Green did to me and others denied many of us our right and ability to determine our futures.
And then, Mike, you reinforce in your following paragraph some of the things that you've spoken about not feeling secure in your home, not being able to trust. Can I take you, though, then to paragraph 106?
yes.
And you talk then about the moment of truth coming when you found out about your youngest brother.
Could I just read something from
Yes,
104 first? I just
absolutely.
think I should say this. My adolescent years, instead of being a time of growth and development, instead I had to find out, to try and find myself, which was to prove an elusive goal. I compensated for lack of confidence, especially around females, by drinking heavily. I lacked stability, drifting from one job to the next, never staying too long in one place, and never being able to trust or form a close relationship with anyone, thinking there was something wrong with me because of what occurred, keeping my unspeakable secret buried deep. So, the moment of truth came in 2002 August, when our youngest brother Chris confided in Jerry and me about the abuse that he had suffered from Green, and revealed that he had written to the church twice and they wouldn't answer him. So it was then we got together and understood what the abuse had cost our families and us. Yes.
Carry on.
Carry on.
Mm-hmm. So perhaps you've talked earlier about it took quite a while for you to fully disclose. This would probably be a good time to touch on why you hadn't reported earlier, and also why your brothers hadn't reported earlier.
Okay.
And that's at paragraph 115.
Yep. We, like other victim survivors, have been asked why we told no one at the time. Why has it taken so many years to report what happened to you? The culture of that time was that we as children had no power at all. If you were accused of something by a nun or priest, you were automatically assumed guilty. If you did have the temerity to protest your innocence, you were generally punished twice. Once for the misdemeanour you were supposed to have committed, and once for calling the nun or a priest a liar. Plus, of course, as children, the abuse that occurred was way beyond our meagre comprehension. To actually put it into words was impossible. I was so traumatised by the events, I never once managed to tell a soul until my brother Jerry and I finally spoke about it in 1985. I'd just been kicked out of the army, and he was heading to Perth, and we had a big booze up, and everyone else went home, and we were sitting around talking, and he mentioned this Father Green, and I said, I think he was a fucking paedophile. And Jerry said, he had a go at me. And I said, yeah, he had a go at me too. So I said to him, I've always been an attacking sort of a person. I said, let's do the bastard. But Jerry, he was still alive then, but Jerry, our mum wasn't well, and she'd believed in this all her life. And we decided we couldn't take that away from her, you know. So I now wish we'd done something about it. It was not until 2002 my brother Chris, encouraged by his counsellor, shared his abuse with us. So then he informed us he had written to the church twice in 2002 and been ignored. And then we know they'd been informed of his sexual abuse, and we wrote further to tell them about we other two. So the response of the church, what did they do? They did what they're good at: ignored, delayed, deferred, detracted, denied. They did anything they could not to accept responsibility until we felt forced to go public. We didn't know really what to expect from the church, but they seemed to draw it out for as long as possible, with many excuses for lack of progress. A visible complaints process didn't seem to be in place then, and they drew things out for so long. Both my brothers began to have nightmares and flashbacks. Chris, not knowing we had also been abused, had first written to Bishop Dunn on the 18th of April 2002, explaining what had happened to him and finishing with, I don't know what to expect from this letter. I just know I have to write it. Having had no answer, he wrote again on the 6th of June, finishing with, I urge you to take some interest in this matter for our own mutual healing benefit. He eventually got replies from the Bishop on the 1st of July 2002 and the Church Professional Standards Committee on the 11th of July 2002. By then, however, because it seems to be taking so long, on advice, he had confided in us and was shocked to learn we had also been abused. So he wrote to the Professional Standards Committee telling them about us and giving him his Perth telephone number for contact. Despite various letters back and forward over the next few months, there did seem to be a deafening silence while they fluffed around with committees, meetings, excuses, claims of an unseen letter, and nobody seeming to know what to do, we made the decision to engage a New Zealand lawyer. With no perceivable progress being made over the next weeks, and realising just how much the Catholic Church were messing us about, we decided to take action. There is an old infantry adage that I've always been fond of: the best means of defence is attack. So we went in boots and all. We went public in the New Zealand Herald on the 7th of the 12th, 2002. This certainly produced some reaction, with Bishop Dunn flying over to Perth to meet us, and also resulted in various other victims coming out of the woodwork. Certainly it wasn't our greatest wish to have the whole sordid business aired in public, but we felt we needed to get some sort of resolution while they appeared to be playing for time. They did fly Christen over to Auckland for a hearing in 2003. Jerry hates them so much he couldn't stand to be near them, and he couldn't take responsibility for what he might do, so he stayed where he is. We went to their place in Ponsonby, accompanied by my sister Mary and our lawyer. They had a couple of QCs with the bishop and various other religious people present, but not too much eventuated from this meeting. They showed us a balance sheet showing there was no money, and I do recall the bishop actually stating that they didn't want to pay us too much because it might set a precedent for future cases. The saga dragged on through 2003. There was another release in the Herald, No Joy for Abused Trio. Both my brothers were still having nightmares and flashbacks. So in late 2003, when an offer was made, it was decided we accept this. The matter was finally settled on the 15th of January 2004. After the settlement, we never heard from the church again, and I only began to take interest after the outrageous statement from the Bishop of Adelaide, which motivated me into finishing the book. I have to say, although the Bishop prattled on about closure, you don't ever feel you've got closure when you continue to wake up suddenly after having dreamed about the whole sordid nightmare that was your main childhood memory. Tellingly, although I'm now back living in New Zealand, both my younger brothers prefer the anonymity of living in Australia after being forced to go public with our story, although they are Kiwis at heart. Basically, they are refugees from their own country.
And you set out in your evidence your belief that there are other abused.
We know there are others. After my book was published, my publisher was contacted immediately by a woman, told him that her brother had also been abused by Green around that time and committed suicide. My publisher put this lady in contact with the Commission, and I believe she's made a submission. Recently, I met and talked to an old school friend from those days. He'd stayed in the general vicinity all those years, and he knew or suspected who the victims are when we were together at school. He shared with us his own horrific story of abuse by Green, and although he has passed away, he did speak to the Commission about 10 days before he died, and I have his permission to share part of his story with you. His father was killed in a car accident when he was 7. Immediately after which, Green zeroed in on him and began abusing him. Soon he became pretty wild and uncontrollable, which you might well understand. His mother, with a 6-year-old brother and 4 other young girls, the youngest a babe in arms, could no longer control him. In desperation, she eventually sent him off to stay with relatives in the country. There, away from the perverted attention of the predator, he settled down and was happier again. Now, this is where my testament does change, because when I first spoke to him about this, it was on Messenger, and I'm deaf, and Messenger's in and out, but when we sat with Sandra, his story changed, so I'm going to tell you what happened. After some months of being away, Green told the mother that he should be at home with her, and he, Green, would help control him. Green went down to where the child was staying, ostensibly to pick him up. Dennis came home from school, saw Green's car in the driveway, and went to the back of the farm and hid. And as soon as Green went, he came back and went inside. And Green stayed in the general vicinity for 2 days, looking for this boy to take him back. Eventually, Green went back, but he got to the mother, and within a week he'd organised for Green organised for him to be brought back home within a week. Green then continued abusing him till he was 11 years old. Can you imagine that? I only remember the one instance of being abused, but I do remember the mental abuse. This poor guy, for 4 years at least, he was abused by this priest. I think that's bloody horrific. Sadly, he has passed away, but lucky he spoke to the commissioners just before he died. He saw our case in the Herald in 2002, got a lawyer himself, and took issue with the church. His experience of reporting to them was similar to ours. He said he had defaced the board and felt very intimidated as they questioned him, seemingly looking for some sort of hole in his story that they could seize upon. He reported that the bishop told him that the church was not responsible for the abuse because they did not employ Father Green. So Dennis asked the bishop, who did then? God. This did not go down too well. The church by then had accepted responsibility for our abuse by Green. So to me, this was a pathetic way to try and avoid responsibility to a single victim on his own. I reckon it's porky telling, although the bishop may well differ. A terminally ill man has no reason to lie, you'd think. I know who I believe. So, support and compassion from the church, you'd hope. This victim suffered a further trauma when he first went to have chemo. On his hospital record, he was listed as RC, Roman Catholic, even though, like the rest of us, he'd tossed away religion years previously. A Catholic liaison officer rocked up to see him, but he soon told her he was no longer a Catholic because he'd been sexually abused by a priest as a child. Are you sure it happened? She said. Are you sure it happened? I'm sure I'm not allowed to repeat what he told her here, but she got out that door pretty quick, she said. This incident highlights a problem we found in this church, the denial. The denial the abuse happened. The denial of responsibility and the silence of the laity. Where are they, the laity? Why are they not questioning and asking for explanations from their leaders? This is serious. These so-called leaders of faith are having input into what has been taught to children in their schools. Many are possibly guilty of permitting crimes against children to go unpunished. I could never send my kid to any school like that. My sister, who acted as conduit for us boys in dealings with the Catholic Church at the time, had this to say: the church at the time did not handle them in the way that it should have. It is my most sincere prayer that those at the top will see the error of their ways and reconcile what was in reality further abuse at that time.
And Mike, you have some suggestions that you would like to make to the commissioners.
I do. So what needs to happen? Commissioners, I agreed to give this testimony today to give voice to the abuse that has happened not just to us, but many children in New Zealand by church institutions, state institutions, and in our case, the Catholic Church. So I'm not just reporting our experience to you today, Commissioners, I'm reporting an experience that many other victim survivors of the church in New Zealand and their families will recognise has only been too similar to their own. The church must be held accountable. The church cannot be trusted, in my experience, to do what must be done so the criminal abuse of children stops. Of the many things I think you need to look at, the confessional is one. I quote from the Heal Project's website: this culture of silence and shame around sex and sexuality creates a breeding ground for child sexual abuse. This is exactly what the confessional does. It forgives these perverts of their crime, does nothing to stop them, and allows to continue on with their deviant ways. Therefore, I strongly recommend that the supposed sanctity of their confessional be totally disregarded, especially legally. There is no doubt in my mind that many of these abusers went to confession after defiling children, got themselves back into a supposed state of grace, then went on to re-offend again and again. Surely the safety and sanctity of the children comes first. When the abuse occurs and is confessed, you have two serious criminal offenders, the abuser and the priest who heard the confession and did nothing about it. This church need to abolish this monstrosity immediately, and all alleged abusers should be interrogated thoroughly as to who they confessed to and or who knew about the offending. This nonsense is what has allowed these abusers to flourish. The other point I'd like to make to your Commissioners is the Catholic Church should in no way be allowed to handle allegations of sexual abuse in the house. Serious sexual abuse is systemic right throughout this organisation worldwide, ably encouraged by their archaic confessional laws. They are extremely reluctant to take ownership of the abuse suffered by my brothers and I, and were extremely difficult to engage in meaningful dialogue. And there were three of us. Imagine the difficulty facing a single victim. Sexual abuse of children, especially of children, is a crime after all. All allegations of sexual abuse should be handled by the priest or, if historic, a non-aligned professional group funded by the church themselves. The Catholic Church, I believe, is the biggest shareholder in faith-based abuse. They don't pay tax anyway, so why can they not take the burden placed on our society of the hundreds, if not thousands, of victims of abuse by their own clergy? They have amply demonstrated they cannot honestly, fairly and charitably deal with the blight that affects their church. This church has a debt not only to victims and their families, but also to the taxpayers. Talking to an old army mate of mine recently who has been a prison guard for 30 years, he told me that most of the prisoners he looked after have been abused in some form or other, and yes, many by faith-based institutions. To the church, I'd say, stop reading from the Judas book of betrayal, denial, and hanging on to the 30 pieces of silver, and read from the Jesus file. Do the right thing. You have the assets. Sell some of them and fund a program for victims run by professionals. I'm sure Jesus would agree with that. You preach that you and your followers are going to inherit the kingdom of heaven, so you should be able to afford to sell a few of your many castles on earth and use the money as reparation for the countless victims of your clergy. I'd also like to address the abusers and enablers out there. Many of you are getting closer and closer to the big D-Day, death. You may think you've been given by going to confession, but I really do have my doubts. Why don't you do something to break the cycle of silence and perhaps gain back some vestige of your own self-respect? Simple. You are propagating a fraud and you are living a lie. Own up for the abuse and or its cover-up. At least have the balls to stand up and be counted. A last chance to do the decent thing before you front up to the big man. Finally, I'm a great fan of the words in Bob Dylan's earlier protest songs. He had a great one protesting about weapon manufacturers' profits while young people died buried in the mud, called Masters of War. I've changed one of the verses and called it Masters of Shame. This is for all you abusers and enablers out there. I think that you'll find when your death takes its toll, all your money, power and confession could never buy back your soul. And I'll tell you further, for I know that it's true. Even Jesus would never forgive what you do. I stand here in solidarity with all abuse victims, both state and faith-based. Most of us have been walking towards thunder all our lives. Commissioners, you have an opportunity here to perhaps allow a little bit of sunshine to shine on us. Please do so. Thank you very much. Could I just say, after this, we're going down to tie some ribbons in memory of the abused victims down at the cathedral. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike, for your testimony. I have no further questions of you, but I will ask the Chair to check if there are any from Council or whether there are any from the Commission.
Thank you, Ms Jones. Are there questions which Council wish to address to Mr Leddingham? Ms McKechnie.
Mr Leddingham, I appear as counsel on behalf of the bishops and congregational leaders of the Catholic Church. Would it help if I came up here?
Yeah, come up.
You'd come to the microphone.
Mr Leddingham, I'm here as counsel. My name is Sally. I'm here as counsel on behalf of the bishops and congregational leaders of the Catholic Church. I don't have any questions for you, Mr Leddingham, but I wanted to acknowledge your evidence. On behalf of the bishops and the congregational leaders, I wanted to acknowledge what you've said today and your hurt and your anger about what happened to you when you were in care. We reiterate the Bishop of Auckland's apology to you for the wrongs that were done to you and your brothers. You should not have been harmed by Father Green. You should not have been hurt when you were in the care of the Diocese of Auckland. Representatives of the Catholic Church of the Auckland Diocese are here, Mr Leddingham, and they have heard what you had to say. And they have heard your anger and your concern about the redress process. The bishops and congregational leaders have a lot of lessons to learn from this commission, and one of those lessons is going to be how to improve the redress process, how to help people like you, the survivors, with their healing.
I don't think you have the capacity to deal with it. I'm saying it needs to be done by non-aligned. I don't think you'll ever have the capacity. You're a dinosaur. You're a thing of the past. I think you have to admit that you can't handle it and contract it out to non-aligned people. I would not trust you people as far as I could kick you. And I'm sorry to have to say that, but that's the way I feel.
Thank you, Mr Leddingham. I think we would acknowledge that we haven't earned your trust, and we will learn the lessons from the Royal Commission in this process when they examine the Catholic Church and try to improve and learn the lessons that we will have from you and other survivors like you. Thank you for your evidence today. Thank you for your courage.
No worries. I die a happy heathen.
Thank you, Mr Leddingham.
Thank you, Ms McKechnie. I now wish to ask my colleagues if any of you have any questions yourselves that you might wish to address to Mr. Leddingham. I'll start with you, Commissioner Paul Gibson.
No questions, but thank you for your courage and your testimony, and to those of your brothers and those others whose stories come forward with you. Thanks.
Thank you. Ms. Alofibai.
Thank you, Mr. Leddingham, for the courage that you spoke with this morning and for the very clear and strong recommendations that you've asked us to look at. Can I just ask you one question? The issue of celibacy in the church.
The issue of?
Celibacy.
Oh, yeah.
With the priest. Do you think that's a problem that we should, that's worthy of further attention?
I think it stands out like a greyhound's balls.
So we can add that to the list of recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Erueti.
Tēnā koe, Mr. Leddingham, and I appreciate that you giving this testimony not only on your own behalf but on behalf of your brothers, so ka nui te mihi ki a koe. Ka nui te mihi ki a koe for giving this testimony on your own behalf but also on behalf of your brothers. It's just picturing you as a 7 or 8 year old when you first experienced this abuse and the difficulty it must have been to, as you say, to articulate what you were experiencing. I suppose you think about if there's someone you're going to talk to that's likely to be your family. But of course, in your case, and it seems in the case of many other young children who have been abused in faith-based institutions, that the family are so closely affiliated to the church that you really can't turn and speak to them either. Was that your experience?
Yeah, we knew we wouldn't be believed. You know, everything was tipped against us, and I didn't understand what it was. You know what I mean? It just it screwed my mind. You know, look, and it screwed my mind for years, and I never really dealt with it till I learned about my younger brother, you know, and I never thought about killing myself, but I thought about killing other people. Is there something wrong with it?
And I wanted to also ask about redress, and you, plainly for you, it's important that any process be with the Catholic Church, that it be independent, as you've emphasised very clearly.
Strongly, it's the only way it'll ever, the truth will ever be got at by them not being able to handle it. They don't deserve to handle it because of what they've done. Read this book. I just recommend you read that. It's a brilliant read.
Yes, and there was a strong, there was a point that was emphasised in the context of state-based care as well. This the importance of independence. And in your affidavit, in your brief of evidence, you describe it as a torturous process, and trying to get information about the redress scheme was difficult as well. So, in addition to independence, are there other features that are important to you that should be part of a redress scheme?
I wouldn't be letting priests near the kids.
Okay.
I'd be certainly, you know, I wouldn't want a priest near my kids. You don't trust them. You know, whatever it was they took from me, I'll never get back. You know what I mean? My kids give me love, but they know I'm a bit standoffish, but they accept that. That's who I am. You know what I mean? Okay. So I've never been able to give them, you know, like when they get into trouble. One of them had a partner who was a moron. I dealt to him, you know, that sort of thing. They'll come to me, but the love side, I'm not really good at it, you know.
Okay.
The aroha.
The aroha. Kia ora. In addition to monetary compensation, a cheque, are there other features that could form part of a redress scheme for you?
Well, I believe that a lot of the victims have clogged up the health system, especially the mental health system, and have been druggies and have had bad lives, and they've cost the taxpayer thousands. And there's people in prison, the same. Now, why should the government be forced to fork out for that, or the taxman? Why? They've got billions of dollars worth of assets. Why can't they sell some assets and fund this program to look after these people? You know, that's the least they could do. Never mind going to confession and getting holy water thrown at you. That does nothing. And prayers, and that's nothing. They need to do something constructive to show they are sorry, you know, to show they are capable of showing aroha for what has been done. And to me, they just sidle away from it all the time.
Kia ora. Thank you.
Thank you. Judge Shaw.
Mr. Leddingham, I don't have any questions. I just want to acknowledge, first of all, the powerfulness of your account. You've said it like it is, and that's deeply appreciated. I also want to acknowledge that because of your experiences, you find it difficult to trust people, and I fully understand that. And so your demonstration today of some trust, at least in the Commission, to hear you, is deeply appreciated. I know it doesn't come easily, and I think that you have shown enormous integrity in doing that, so I want to acknowledge that as well. And could you just pass on from the Commission to your brothers our deep gratitude for the contribution that they have allowed you to make on their behalf? It's much appreciated.
Thank you.
Thank you.
As I said, we've been walking through the thunder for a lot of years,
Yes.
but also not only might we be coming out into the sun, but the cliff faces there that we might fall off soon and die.
Oh,
so
well,
it needed to be done.
Yes.
And thank you for bringing this commission to... It needed to be done before I died.
well, thank you very much indeed, Mr. Leddingham.
Mr. Leddingham, I have the final word. I simply want to reflect and endorse what has been said by my colleagues. You are to be thanked for having the courage to speak in public about what has happened, and you are to be respected for the force with which you have applied to what needs to happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Mr. James.
Thank you, Mr. Leddingham. That concludes your evidence, and thank you very much for your testimony today.
Thank you.